So, Budget Day in the UK has been and gone, and all over bar the shouting. And the amount of shouting seems to be fairly muted this year, partly because the budget, despite what was trailed, has turned out to be not a very big deal. £26 billion of extra tax raised, well, that's the headline figure. But when you get into the detail, you realise that that's a figure over the next 5 years, and most of that won't materialise until about 2030. So in terms of what's going to happen immediately, well, it's relatively small. And if we think about that 26 billion, then that's maybe a good moment to look at this image again, which is the amount of money that the big four UK banks distributed to their shareholders in 2023. And that's the big blue circle around the outside, and that's £24 billion. So that's 1 year's distribution to shareholders of the big four banks. They actually made much more profit than that, of course, and this year they're on target to make about £50 billion of profit. So 26 billion of additional tax over 5 years, well, that sort of pales into significance when you look at the numbers here, the amount of money which is going into bank profits. And over here, of course, we've seen this before. This is the English water companies. This is up till 2019, so they've made even more money since then. But the little blue slither we remember is the amount of money the government got when it sold the water companies. And the big green section is the amount of money that those water companies have paid to their shareholders over a 30-year period. And that's about 55 billion. So that's a couple of billion a year as well. So frankly, in terms of the amounts of money that's being paid out in these sort of situations, the government's 26 billion over 5 years is, as I say, fairly trivial. But it does raise the question, what about government debt? Because I think the thing that everybody got quite interested in around this year's budget was this famous discussion around the bond market and the fact that the government is paying about £100 billion a year in interest on its debt, and that's about 8% of its total spending. And people, I think, as I say, did find that quite surprising. It's a huge number. And so it's worth reflecting just briefly in the context of these images, quite what is going on there. How come the government owes quite so much money? And to whom, as a matter of interest? Well, a good chunk of it is going abroad, foreign holders of a UK debt, quite a lot of it to UK pension funds, and quite a lot of it to UK banks. So what's really going on here is that the government is giving money away with one hand and having to borrow it back to spend with the other. And actually, the water companies is a good example of that, because if you look at that and you say, well, the government got in a few £1 million over here when it sold the water companies, and then there's sort of 50, 60, in fact now more like 70 or 80 billion pounds that's been paid out in terms of profits and dividends and that sort of thing. Well, that's 60, 70 billion pounds over that period that the government could have. Government's given that money away. And similarly with the banks, well, the banks make most of their money by lending money at a profit, and that money is generated by the banks because the government lets them generate money out of nothing. It's not money they've got. So again, there's a huge opportunity here for the government to recoup a very significant amount of those profits if it understood how that money is leaking out of the economy into, for example, the shareholders of these banks, many of whom are abroad, and also, of course, into the activities that these banks are financing, which are largely around property and financial transactions. Another image we've got over, don't know where it is, here, which shows the amount of bank lending in the economy. And as we can see, the big red section, that's all about lending to property, and this big pink section is all about lending to the finance market. So here they are using bank money, generating more profits, which are also going to investors. And that represents, again, another huge outflow from the economy, and most importantly, money that's not available anymore to the productive economy. So as I say, a way of looking at this is to say that the government is effectively handing money to wealthy institutions, wealthy companies, wealthy people, and then borrowing it back because it believes that those wealthy companies and institutions and people can use that money to generate more wealth, and that will generate GDP. As we know, in fact, they're not generating wealth with that money, they're extracting wealth with that money. And because they're extracting it, it's no longer available for productive use. And that, as I say, is why the government has to borrow it back. So there are big policy changes the government could make there. We didn't see any of that in the budget. The budget was a bit of a damp squib, nothing like the radical reforms that we need or have looked for. but that's the way politics is at the moment. The government is being very conservative, and we're simply not getting the sort of level of reform that we seriously need.